Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming along today, and thank you for having me to your group. I work for a company called City Science. So City Science, as I'd mentioned before, we are data analysts, accountants, software developers, engineers, transport planners. We all came to City Science to support businesses to decarbonise. The company was started in 2015. I joined in 2020. Since then, we've grown from about 15 people to about 35 people. And for all of us, me specifically, decarbonisation and sustainability is a must. The need for this is not going to go away anytime soon. So for me, working in this business, I love watching the different innovations, technical developments that we're making, that we're trying to use to give people the tools to make better decisions around carbon emissions. Today, we are going to take a flying visit through some of the core concepts of decarbonisation, sustainability and net zero, get you guys a bit more familiar with how you can start that journey, or key things to think about and good places to start. From the other SMEs that I've spoken to, trying to wade through the swathes of information that there is on the internet can be quite overwhelming. So hopefully this will give you some kind of core places to start and things to think about. So overarching all of this really is this concept of sustainability. And I've put in here the United Nations definition of that, which is the avoidance of the depletion of natural resources in order to maintain an ecological balance. So ultimately, I would approach this as, if we want to carry on as the human species on this planet without completely decimating it and ourselves, we need to be more sustainable. And we need a crib sheet to understand what that incorporates. So what resources are we talking about? The United Nations has come up with a great set of sustainable development goals. So they've done the hard work, and these have been universally agreed across all countries as integral to developing a sustainable world. So they cover poverty, hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water, energy, work, infrastructure, clean seas, climate action, reduced inequalities. There's a massive variety there, so lots of options really to dive into and get a bit more detail on what we can be doing in our businesses to be more sustainable. The other half of this kind of equation, I guess, and one element of that sustainability, one of those sustainability goals is net zero. So net zero is reducing your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions to zero, or to a residual level that's consistent with reaching net zero emissions at the global or sector level, in line with 1.5 centigrade aligned pathways. We'll disseminate that a minute. So back in 2015, the UK government signed up to the Paris Agreement. And the aim of the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming to 1.5 centigrade. The way that they believe we can do that is to reduce our carbon emissions to 1990 levels and get to net zero. So countries are required to bring in policies that will action change in fuel and energy usage to limit those greenhouse gas emissions, which are contributing to warming the planet. There are several different types of greenhouse gases. So mostly we talk about carbon, but actually there are other gases like methane, and they are often converted into an equivalent value of carbon emissions so that we can just lump them all together into like a carbon emissions equivalent value. Currently, the government has enforced very few legal requirements around its net zero policies. So we know that from 2030, there's going to be a ban on fossil fuel cars, and that all diesel fueled trains are going to be removed by 2040. In October 2021, they issued their net zero strategy, and that set out what their targets are around energy generation. So they said they were going to generate 40 gigawatts from offshore wind and 5 gigawatts from hydrogen. But so far, there's been pretty inconsistent funding pots for that. So there's been a lot of competitions to win money for innovation, and also for local authorities. They've had to bid for funding to get funding to do net zero kind of things in their local authorities. So you'll tend to see things are quite piecemeal. What you can get in Langport is going to be different to say what another town can get for opportunities for net zero funding as well. So it's been quite location and sector specific. Recommendations have gone to the government, actually, as an aside, to that they need to kind of streamline this a lot better and make it a lot clearer and consistent. Another angle on this then is the kind of legal regulation and reporting. So there are currently some legal requirements for companies out there. Generally, it's larger companies. We're starting to see a bit of a push down now in supply chains for smaller companies to report up to larger customers on their own sustainability and carbon footprints. So the M&Ss and the Tesco's of the world now have like standards that they expect their suppliers to report against. Here I've set out a summary of what some of the current rules and regulations are and guidance around sustainability and net zero. So we've got the streamlined energy and carbon reporting that forms part of the Companies Act and is applicable to large companies. We've got the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosure recommendations. That is currently only applicable to UK listed companies, financial services firms, and public interest entities. But in the government's funding document for green finance, they have said that they intend to push this down to all companies eventually. And then we've got the International Sustainability Standards Board. So they are currently developing an accounting standard around sustainability and around carbon emissions. So that is kind of what's out there at the moment in terms of legal regulation. It's also worth noting different sectors have seen increased demands as well. So the British Retail Consortium has signed all of its members up to being net zero by 2040. So all of their members are now required to have some transition plans in place. If we have a quick look at the streamlined energy and carbon reporting, so this is what forms part of the Companies Act already. Their main requirement is to get businesses to assess what their main energy uses are and their emissions, and to provide a comparable basis for assessment. So what they do is they provide a KPI of emissions per pound of revenue or emissions per employee. And that allows the government to assess how energy intensive different sectors are, and allows the person who's reading their accounts to compare their emission levels to other companies. So that kind of first element there, the first two questions on there, give us the ability to compare companies on their emissions and also to understand what their emissions are. And then that final question there, what are you doing to reduce your carbon emissions, actually has no specific requirements against it outside of they just want you to report on it. So I've seen company accounts where the response in their financial statements is that they've done nothing. And that is meeting the requirement of reporting against it. Other companies will provide full-blown glossy reports with images and targets to demonstrate what they're doing. So at the moment, there is really just a massive spectrum of responses out there. And the government approach to this just appears to be that they want people to report on it, not that they are putting out a requirement for everyone to be net zero, because for some companies that's just not achievable. And then at the bottom here, I've just defined what the different scopes are. So scope 1 is emissions from the fuel you use in your business operations directly. So we're thinking petrol, gas, diesel, kerosene, whatever it is you use to heat your home. Scope 2 then is emissions from electricity. So whatever the emissions are from your electricity that you use. And there are the government publishes conversion factors for this that you can use to calculate them. And then scope 3 is all other types of emissions. So that could be logistics, deliveries, business travel, employee commuting, what happens to your products and services at the end of their lifetime. That's a much bigger calculation and kind of far more widespread. I like to think of that as all the emissions that occur because your business exists. So if you're Dyson, this goes as far as the electricity that your buyers use for the hairdryers that they use. So it can kind of go that far. Okay, and then just to circle back a little bit, so the task force for climate related financial disclosures, these have really become kind of the core columns, the core areas that people are using for climate related reporting. So the other elements, your carbon footprinting is thinking about what impact your business has on the wider environment and what your operations and energies use to contribute to climate change. These disclosures, the Task Force for Climate Related Disclosures, look at this from the other side. So they ask, can you assess what impact climate change is going to have on your business? And what are you doing to mitigate those impacts and risks? So I'm just going, before we jump into these 4 themes, I'm going to break down. So climate related is financial risks and opportunities that are related to climate change. So that could be the financial implications of changing to a low carbon economy and those physical risks. So we're looking at the impact of increased renewable energy, improved energy efficiency, changing consumer behaviours, increased weather events, increased flooding, all those kind of elements. How are they going to impact your business? So we're split into the 4 main categories here. I'm just going to run you through each of them. So governance is thinking about what oversight does your board have of climate related risks and opportunities? How does management assess them? And what frameworks and policies do you have in place? Strategy is thinking about what long-term, short-term and medium-term risks are there to your business? What's the potential impact of them? How resilient is your strategy to climate change? And then thinking about different scenarios. So what if climate change is quicker than we anticipate, or that we do increase by 2.5 centigrade? What's likely to be the impact on your business? Risk management. So how does your company identify those risks? How often are they looking for those risks? How are they managed? What's the process? Who's responsible for looking for those risks? And how have you integrated that with your wider risk management process? And then metrics and targets. What KPIs are you using to assess climate risk? Do you disclose your emissions and the related risks? Do you discuss those targets? So have you got a target to reduce your water usage by 2030, or kind of what are those different metrics that you're using to measure the risk of climate change against your business? Ultimately, as an SME, there are no legal requirements for you to decarbonize at all. So ultimately, your prioritization around this needs to come back to what is your goal? Why are you doing this? There's government has a strategy for how it's going to get us all to net zero. It's not fail-safe, it's not completely worked out, but they've got the bones of a structure, and Chris Stark assures me it's good enough. So hopefully we definitely should get there. There are some benefits though to making changes now. So you could be reducing that corporate risk. So making it easier to get finance in the future. Finance companies, banks are being put under a lot of pressure to assess companies for their climate risk now. So by showing that you've already thought about this and you've got a plan in place, you're almost preempting that before it comes along. Physical risk, so you're reducing your susceptibility to weather events or reliance on the energy grid, or even increased energy costs. Going concern. So where does your business fit in a low carbon economy? Is it going to fit with changing consumer behaviours? Do you need to change or enhance the services or products that you're supplying to make sure that you don't risk losing customers? We've seen an increased demand from large companies. I mentioned that their suppliers demonstrate how they're reducing their carbon emissions. So having a strategy and plan in place just means you're ticking that box immediately. You're not at risk of losing any customers. And we're also seeing surveys on how important it is now to employees and graduates to know that their employers are sustainable, have sustainability plans. I know anecdotally, having spoken to firms during interviews, they're being asked the question, what are you doing to reduce your impact on the climate? And then there's branding and marketing, which clearly is one of the biggest incentives for large businesses at the moment. And ultimately, the reason we're in this is to minimize climate change. So really, it's back to you to think about which of these would you priority, how far, and that will really reveal how far you want to go and potentially change your business operations. A couple of other things to think about as an SME. What happens if you don't meet these targets? So if you set targets for yourself and share them widely, and part of the reason you're doing this is for branding and marketing, and then for whatever reason you don't meet those targets, what's the wider impact there? So I would personally approach this at the level of sustainability, with net zero being a part of that. They're not mutually exclusive. Climate change is one part of sustainability agenda, but we kind of need to think about all of the whole piece if we want to kind of build a sustainable future. So I would recommend looking at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, thinking about how they might be applicable to your business. Some might not be, that's okay. But just think about how you could reduce your impact or improve your impact if it's a positive one. And that could be reducing the water usage of your company, increasing your links with local schools to share your knowledge, social mobility. Yeah, so there's a few extra considerations to think about there. Okay, for argument's sake, I'm going to assume that you do want to become a net zero company, and that's one of your main goals. I just wanted to walk you through kind of the key steps to think about within that. There's loads of great tools out there. They aim to give you a high-level overview of what your emissions are and what your carbon footprint is. Personally, I quite like the Business Climate Hub. So this is a government initiative that's underpinned by the UN, and it enables you to publicly make a commitment. So they have a map of all the different companies who have made a commitment to get to net zero. And also it provides you with a pool of resources to get to net zero. They've actually recently tidied up their website. So at the moment, there are some quite clear steps to take that really neatly guide you through. Or you can go to the tools website, where there is a cacophony of different tools and like guidance that you can use as well. You don't have to sign up to a government pledge. You don't have to sign up to any public pledges. There are other initiatives you can sign up to as well, and I'll go through them in a minute, like the science-based targets, CDP, B Corp. We'll have a chat over what they are and why they're good or not in a second. So once you've decided you're going to do this, you need to understand what your emissions are, where they're coming from, and that will tell you what your main challenges or opportunities are likely to be. You can do this yourself, so you can build a spreadsheet and use the government conversion factors, or you can use an online tool. So the SME Climate Hub gives you access to the normative hub for free, and that will estimate your business emissions based on the data that you put into it. So that's going to be things like your building energy, how much mileage you've done. You'll need to do that for a set period of time. and we are very much seeing that the government is pushing through lining this up with financial reporting. So I would definitely recommend sticking to whatever your financial year end is that you report against. So if your year end is December, do your carbon footprint to the end of December. If you are a sole trader and you're working to the 5th of April, do it to the 5th of April or the end of March, whichever is closest. Once you've established what your baseline emissions are, you can spot where your biggest culprits are. So where you can have the biggest impact of reducing your carbon footprint. There could be some actions within that that make a big financial sense and offer a return on investment. They might lower your energy costs, lower your fuel costs, increase efficiencies. There will be some that don't. And again, it just brings it back to that prioritization piece. What are you doing this for? Is it worth that investment? There might be some elements of these that rely on your employees or your supply chain to support you. So all these actions will have a different priority and a different level of deliverability. Ultimately, there will be some emissions that you just can't shift. They're out of your control, and these are emissions that you might look to offset. So we'll cover a few of those concepts in a minute. Baselining your emissions, we talked about the online fuel and the 3 different scopes. So you've got your scopes here for your company fuel use. Generally, your bills will report on the level of kilowatts that you've used. So you can then directly convert that using the government conversion rates, or if you pop those kilowatts off your bill into the tool, they'll then calculate it for you. The next level is scope 2, so this is electricity. That's because the way electricity is generated with the grid is generally through the burning of fossil fuels. Not entirely anymore, but it does still burn fossil fuels to generate electricity. There are 2 levels of argument here. One is if you've got a renewable energy tariff, then technically your impact should be 0. The other side of that is that realistically, the electricity that comes through your grid, you don't know what it's being generated from. So you have a contract with your energy provider that they will buy X many kilowatts of renewable sourced energy, but actually what comes into your house or into your business has just come from the grid, which is a mixed bag. So it's entirely up to you which of those options you choose to take. You can rest assured though, so the government has pledged by 2035, the grid will be nil. It will all be renewable sourced energy. So when we come to 2035, hopefully scope 2 should be nil regardless. And then I mentioned scope 3. Scope 3 is all the other emissions that occurs because your business exists. This diagram that I've got here on this slide comes from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And if you want to know a bit more about how scope 3 is calculated, they've done a really nice, easy to read guide about the supply chain emissions. So I can recommend reading that. I've just built a really basic roadmap here. So when you're thinking about building a roadmap, you need to think about what your company objectives are. How can you build on a roadmap that might be acceptable to your team or your board? Prioritize that roadmap. So think about what the budgets are, whether or not you're looking for things with a high return on investment or that are going to make the biggest impact. Think about what's public facing. So a lot of companies we've seen are prioritizing elements of this that are public facing because for their branding, that's what's important. You need to think about the time frame that this is going to take as well. So how long is it going to take you to implement some of these actions? And therefore that's going to dictate when might you be able to declare yourself net zero. Go through each of these emissions, can think about whether there's an action, an activity, an investment or a policy you can change to reduce those emissions. So for embodied carbon and asset purchases like laptops, that might be just finding a reliable provider of refurbished laptops as your first option for every purchase, and that's going to reduce the carbon emission of those laptops for you. So things that you might not be able to change will be things like HGVs are a prime example. Even if you don't use them, perhaps your logistics company do. Those emissions will become your residual emissions. So this kind of end column that I've got here are those residual emissions that are really hard to get rid of. Pretty much all businesses are going to have them. Not entirely, they might offset through other reasons, but it's going to be hard to change some of those core residual emissions. Legitimately, to call yourself net zero, then you need to reduce that carbon somewhere outside of your business. So that could be through tree planting, so sequestration, or carbon avoidance. We'll go through some of those now. So offsetting can be a bit of a controversial, touchy area. I'm going to try and be as uncontroversial as possible. So carbon offsetting projects are interventions to generate greenhouse gas emissions reductions or storage elsewhere to compensate for emissions made in your business. So that could be undertaken voluntarily or for compliance. And a good example of these are carbon credits, which can be purchased from a UK register of verified woodland carbon credits. So these nature-based solutions here of tree planting, peatland restoration, aquatic restoration, they all look to essentially suck out carbon from the atmosphere through sequestration. Insetting is the idea that these interventions can be done within your own supply chain. So the idea that if you're going to invest money in reducing carbon emissions somewhere, potentially you could do it in your own supply chain, and that will benefit you further. So an example of that I can give you is a local organic farm who then helped their supplier to invest in HGVs that operate in biodiesel. So then the farm saw their scope 3 emissions reduce, and the supplier saw their scope 1 emissions reduce. So they got a direct benefit from that within their supply chain. So that's an example of clean energy solutions. So you're looking to deploy an alternative to fossil fuels. So that could be anything from solars, like the picture here. That could be just changing behavior. So supporting your employees to take low carbon transport options, or kind of alternative behaviors that we can use to reduce our burning of the fossil fuels. And then finally, the golden unicorn that's not quite developed as much as we would like yet, but technological solutions. So carbon capture, can we just suck carbon out the air and, I don't know, turn it into diamonds or bury it underground? So these are kind of the three main options of these. Technically, the clean energy solutions will hopefully start to see reducing as an option, because as we change to low carbon behaviours, there's less opportunity to then reduce that further. So where are you on your journey? The basics of offsetting, bit of a controversial area. If you get to the point where you can't reduce your emissions anymore and you want to offset the rest, this is kind of a good crib sheet, I guess, of thinking about how you do it. So how reliable is that offset that you're going to purchase? Can it be clearly measured? How reassured are you that it's being performed? This pyramid kind of sets out what I think is a reliable way of choosing those. So anything you do in your own supply chain, you should be able to get a pretty good level of assurance around, and you'll have the ability to verify the impact of that. After that, you then have verified carbon credits. So this could be looking at the UK Land Carbon Registry. They've got a list there of people that are selling registered UK generated carbon credits. So trees that are being planted in the UK that you can then go and purchase carbon credits from. There's also a couple of other standards out there, like the gold standard and verified, who do Vera. they have been widely accepted as quality assurance against carbon credits. And they're on the land carbon registry is on an open market registry, so anyone can go online and see that you have purchased those carbon credits as well. So you're not at risk of someone accusing you of not having purchased some. They can see it openly on the internet. And then finally, we've got these unverified credits at the bottom here, or I probably should include in that kind of independently verified carbon credits, shall we say. And the market is awash with these. They are everywhere. I'd say you purchase them at your own risk. You know what you get what you pay for. They tend to be a lot cheaper. They tend to be international credits. So there's this question around international or local. Personally, I believe that we generate our carbon emissions pretty much all in the UK. So for us, the prioritization would be to reduce carbon emissions within the UK where we can. However, I fully accept that we can all see the benefits of reducing deforestation and doing reforestation in Brazil. So if that's something that you're keen to support, you want to get out there and get it done, then absolutely. It just comes with a further afield carbon emission reduction. And you can pay anything from £5 to £100 or more per tonne of carbon emissions here, depending on what you choose. So there really is just a massive market out there. One final point around carbon credits is that they have to have additionality. So this concept that the offset must be in addition to any other planned activities or operations. So if a cider farm was planning to plant a field full of apple trees and they're going to do it anyway, they can't then claim to sell those carbon credits because it just wouldn't meet that additionality criteria. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on benchmarking. So as well as carbon credits providers appearing, we've also seen an increase in benchmarking. These are an opportunity to attach your progress to a known brand for recognition. They tend to be operated by not-for-profit organisations in an attempt to show some element of independence. But currently there's no government-led or approved standard for being a green, sustainable or net zero company. Each of these that I've put here, these are kind of quite high level and accepted ones. They've all got their own benefits and criticisms. Some focus more on net zero specifically, so the Carbon Trust one here and science-based targets are all very much around net zero. Some are looking more at sustainability. So the B Corp looks at your whole business and pulls out kind of different levels of sustainability. There's no one size fits all. They all come with costs attached. So that's worth bearing in mind, which is why I quite like the SME Climate Hub, because you can make a pledge there, it's free, it's online, everyone can see it, and it's endorsed by the UN. Additionally, there are some sector-specific pledges. So I mentioned Tesco's and M&S, and they are examples where they've created their own standards for suppliers to sign up to. So you might see within your supply chain, there's an opportunity to choose something there too. And then I've got a list of resources here that I will share with the slides that Yvonne can take away and share with you as well. Thank you.